computer. And I'm going to spotlight myself so you all see me full screen, I hope. And I'm going to mute everybody. And our co-host, Kim, can unmute himself as needed. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Everybody's muted now except me and possibly Kim. And so this is our fourth meeting. The first two meetings we did chapter 1, and next one chapter 2. And on this meeting we're going to do chapter 3. I suspect we'll get through it, but our tack here is to not be in a hurry, not waste words, but if we have questions and things to talk about, then we will do it. This is about a 10-page chapter, so I think we might get through it, but if we don't, it's no problem. So let's just see what's going on in the chat here. So I'm going to, as usual, read parts of it, a few parts, and then we'll stop and have questions and discussion. So this chapter 3, just to review, chapter 1 was called Separation, I think Separation Perfected. Yeah, and chapter 2 was the commodity as spectacle. So that got the kind of economic stuff. And this chapter, as by its title, is kind of about conflict and unity and how those things interact. And so it's called Unity and Division Within Appearances. Appearances would be just another name for spectacle. And here's a quote, which is obvious, is one of the funnier things in the book. It's obviously completely ironic. He's quoting the Chinese Stalinists, i.e. the Maoists, in one of their official publications in 1964. So this is when Mao is first stirring up the conflict that is going to become called the Cultural Revolution in the next few, a year or two later. Basically, Mao was not out of power. He was still the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, but he had been sort of demoted after the catastrophic failure of his Great Leap Forward and other policies. So this is the Maoist, it's a publication that's kind of bombastically saying, we're long live Chairman Mao, and we're in a intense struggle here against these rival bureaucrats of Mao. And so this is their rhetoric, which is a sort of pseudo-Marxist, pseudo-dialectical thing. But Debord quotes it here because it's sort of ironically true, or true in a way, in the sense that they don't even realize they're talking about themselves and that they are exemplifying these horrible enemies they think they're evoking. So here is this official thing from Red Flag, which is the Peking so-called theoretical journal, 1964. An intense new polemic is unfolding on the philosophical front in this country, focusing on the concepts one divides into two and two fuse into one. This debate is a struggle between those who are for and those who are against the materialist dialectic, a struggle between two conceptions of the world, the proletarian conception and the bourgeois conception. Those who maintain that one divides into two is the fundamental law of things are on the side of the materialist dialectic, i.e. the proletarian thing. Those who maintain that the fundamental law of things is that two fuse into one are against the materialist dialectic. The two sides have drawn a clear line of demarcation between them, and their arguments are diametrically opposed. This polemic is a reflection, on the ideological level, of the acute and complex class struggle taking place in China and in the world, unquote. So this first thesis I'm going to read, I'm not going to comment on because until we get through it, it's so abstract. Basically, it's kind of summarizing the rest of the chapter in 2 sentences or something. The spectacle, like modern society itself, is at once united and divided. The unity of each is based on violent divisions. But when this contradiction emerges in the spectacle, it is itself contradicted by a reversal of its meaning. The division it presents is unitary, while the unity it presents is divided. Next thesis. So these next two theses, among other things, kind of illustrate what that first one is doing. Although the struggles between different powers for control of the same socioeconomic system are officially presented as fundamental antagonisms, they actually reflect that system's fundamental unity, both internationally and within each nation. Next thesis. The sham spectacular struggles between rival forms of separate power are at the same time real, in that they reflect the system's uneven and conflictual development and the more or less contradictory interests of the classes or sections of classes that accept that system and strive to carve out a role for themselves within it. Just as the development of the most advanced economies involves clashes between different priorities, totalitarian state bureaucratic forms of economic management and countries under colonialism or semi-colonialism also exhibit highly divergent types of production and power. By invoking any number of different criteria, the spectacle can present these oppositions as totally distinct social systems, as if they were. But in reality, they are nothing but particular sectors whose fundamental essence lies in the global system that contains them. The single movement that has turned the whole planet into its field of operation, capitalism. So let's stop there. And you can raise your digital hand, and you can also put questions in the chat, and Kim will, kind of monitor that and let me know theirs. So, B. Shep, is your name Shep?
Benjamin. Benjamin is
Yeah,
fine.
Benjamin. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I love the discussion about Debord's friendships. I'm very interested in this idea of friendship. And I'm interested in looking at this idea that the spectacle, like modern society itself, is at once united and divided. I was wondering if he is referring to any of his internal movement dynamics. I mean, this is a period when there was a lot of conflict. I mean, and so I'm just wondering, what was his relationship with the French Communist Party? I know Lefebvre got kicked out of the French Communist Party, Guy Debord was never doctrinaire, never orthodox. What was his relationship with other sort of French social movements? Obviously, there's 68, there's the Notre Dame stuff, God is dead. But what was his relationship? If and then here's this Maoist discussion, which eventually people start talking about the Great Leap Forward at some point. And so I was just wondering if Is that referential at all, or is he talking about the spectacle outside? It wasn't internal.
Well, I mean, here he's talking about the larger things.
Yeah.
Uh, Elsewhere, he'll talk about, like, of course, there's a psychological component of the spectacle, and what does the individual confronted with the TV screen, what's going on in there, or what's going on in the worker if he feels alienated with blah, blah, blah. Or there's social conflicts and so on. But here, in these opening theses, he's talking globally.
Okay.
He's saying that in uh, back in that time, it's less the case now. For example, globally, uh, it was East against West, the
Right.
communists against the democracies, so-called,
Yeah.
et cetera. And so uh, he's saying, I mean, one thing of that is that, well, actually, it is the same system. There are
Right.
differences within it, but basically it's the same system. And so, if what's going on is not so-called capitalism versus communism, uh, because both of those things are actually fundamentally the same, uh,
Okay.
even though they appear to have conflicts. And then in the next thesis, he's saying, well, it's not that these conflicts aren't real. These are real conflicts. I mean, they'll kill
They are
millions
real.
of people, have wars, this, because of course there are these divisions. That's what he's been saying. There's this unified system, and yet this unified system is full of a dog eat dog, uh, kind of thing, both between different, like, the Russians and the United States, or whatever, but also within countries, you'll have conflicts, that will be going on.
Right.
And so he's talking on that level.
Right.
Don't get it into, like, is he talking about getting pissed off at his friend or something? Of course, those things have some connection, but here he's talking about the larger picture. And so,
I mean, at some point, I would be interested in, at some point, or if you can point us to what his relationship was with some of the other French social movements of the period, or the
yeah.
French Communist Party.
Yeah,
I
oh,
mean,
in most cases, with the French Communist Party, deadly enemy.
okay,
No, I mean, that's an easy one. There
okay,
might be some other, like Lefebvre, he was a friend with for a while, uh,
hmm,
even though Lefebvre was an ex-Stalinist, uh,
right.
and also a professor, which normally Debord thought they were full of shit. But in that case, he'd make an exception. And then later he did split from him again. But um,
He split
uh,
with Lefebvre.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah. Have
okay.
you read the Situationist Anthology?
I have it downstairs, so
Okay,
there's a
well,
bit on that. I will look at that.
yeah, you can look at that. There's uh, most of this group did that last fall, basically.
Okay,
Was that went through that. So that's something that you might want to go back for. Mike
okay.
Bellitt, hey, you're muted, Mike. Mike, you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so what I saw in that introduction was, the Peking Review or whatever was saying, here's the dialectic, there's either this or that, and then Debord goes on and says, well, actually in the dialectic there's a unity of opposites,
Yeah,
and the unity of opposites in the case of the world system is the social relation that Marx called capital,
yeah,
right? And the opposites, the particular opposites, are real in the sense that there are classes, and but there are and they do conflict. And what are they conflicting over? They're conflicting over the the wealth that the workers create. Wage labor creates capital,
Yeah.
and it reproduces it. So you have, and then you have the situation like I was at the May Day march in Fremantle yesterday. You have the situation where the unions are saying, we're for a fair wage and all of this kind of thing, and it's part of the class conflict. But they don't mention class. They want to be part of the national unity, the national state. The class collaborationists want that sort of power, and they're missing the point. But anyway, I'll shut up now.
Okay, Bruce.
Good evening. Something which I think in a substantial way validates the analysis here is what happened in Eastern Europe after 1989 when the Soviet system collapsed in that part of the world. And that is that a great many of the top bureaucrats who were basically the people running the bureaucracies that managed the economy after the system collapsed, they rapidly and very easily transitioned to becoming top executives of private corporations. So they made a virtually seamless transition from being part of a system that was supposedly in absolute confrontation with the West into becoming leading corporate executives and being synonymous with the system that existed in the West.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Peter.
Yeah, I love the phrase sham spectacular struggles. I think it says so much in those three words. Both, I know he's talking in a certain sense about the Cold War here, between, so-called communism and capitalism. And I think as Bruce was saying, that kind of the way that they were easily able to transition between one and another at the end, but then also they propped each other up, right? I mean, the fact that they never really went to war except at the margins, and they were dependent on each other for support, I think is pretty clear now in the post 89, 91 world. But also I like this as a way to conceptualize some of the electoral battles in Western capitalist states. This idea that it's a sham. We know that they're representing capitalist interests, even when they yell and scream at each other. Democrats and Republicans can get together to support a genocide if they want to, or to pass whatever legislation bail out banks, even though they really are, they're arguing about how to divide that surplus. There is a reality to it, but it's a sham in the end for the rest of us.
Yeah, and they may or may not know it. Many of them do know it, but some of them are so clueless that they actually believe their party line. Kim.
Oh, I just wanted to make a quick comment. When I was reading 54, 55, 56, I kept thinking Lenin is in the background, particularly imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, because he talks about, the division of the world, uneven development, struggles between different powers for control. However, we're quite a bit along in history here. We're way past the Russian Revolution and past Stalin as well. But I could see Lenin sort of lurching in the background there.
Yeah, well, needless to most of this this book that we're going through is a very sharp critique of Leninism, of Bolshevism, and so on. But you also have to bear in mind, and we may get to nuances like this. Lenin and Trotsky were both brilliant, sincere revolutionaries, and one of the reasons that they managed to have the power and the prestige that they had is that they were that. It was obvious, like when everybody else was compromising during World War I, they didn't. All the socialist parties were rallying to their country and, the patriotism and all this. And so that, they had some valid aspects to them. and Lenin, among other things, did write on these topics, and maybe some of the things that he wrote about them could be debated with, but he was at the time, along with Rosa Luxemburg and, Trotsky and a few other people, the ones who were sort of in the, when people were looking at this, like who's radical, they were among the people competing to say, well, we need to do this, and all that sounds really good. And look, they won in Russia. Yay. I mean, that's very impressive, all this. So then, of course, soon after that, people become disillusioned, some people. So probably some of this lingo, you could take it like out of one of Lenin's books about imperialism or about and so on. Judy.
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering I think it was Peter, and you were talking about what you said it was a sham in the end. What did you mean by that?
Well, let's see. When I was
give a
saying
direct
something
response?
was a sham,
Yeah, Peter, I think, was it Peter? Somebody who was talking before
well,
you?
it says the sham spectacular struggles between rival forms of separate power are at the same time real. That the line you're talking about?
I think, and you were discussing it, and something being a sham, at the end it was a sham. What were you talking about?
Oh,
I can,
yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
I might have said that is okay. Yeah, no, my point is that, the fights between groups like Democrats and Republicans or in other countries between bourgeois parties are just, they're shams. They're not going to liberate us from capitalism. Their fights are not real fights because they're fighting over how they're going to best divide, the surplus the workers generate. So there's no reality they're not going to give us freedom in any capacity, but they act like they're going to lead us to some great future.
Yeah. But at the same time, as noted, they are real struggles. I mean, there are people, depending on the country, who will be fighting to the death over those things, because if they lose, they go bankrupt, or if they, if they lose, they end up in jail. It depends on the society they're in, but they're real struggles, and people will go through their lives fighting those struggles without while scarcely even thinking, well, wait a minute, are there ways in which we're just like two sock puppets arguing with each other?
Well, so they're a sham in one sense, but in another sense,
Yeah.
they're very real.
Yeah. And so
Because I
depending
don't
on the
think,
context,
I think it's kind of condescending to dish the, proletariat struggles because they're not high up enough, I mean,
what proletariat struggle?
they do mean something.
Well, if you mean, for example, a proletarian struggle, like going on a strike or something.
Well, I mean the whole, like what they say, how the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
I mean, if some Democratic candidate gets elected and so the poor people get, $200 worth of food stamps, that's a victory. It may not be,
Yeah.
you
Sure.
know,
Yeah. So you have to weigh those things.
right.
Like, I mean, even Hitler brought things better than a $200 benefit. I mean, there were a lot of benefits that came with that, and you have to just, well, what's the context of this? Suddenly, Hitler has banished unemployment, so is he a hero? It just depends, in some circumstances, you might want to fight for that 200 a month.
Well, I think
And-
maybe
and-
Hitler is not the best analogy.
Well, it's a good analogy because it's an extreme case. I mean, if you just said, did he make some
I
improvements?
know, but
A lot of it-
if you're talking about some Biden and Trump, for example, you're not talking about Hitler. You're not talking about someone who's gonna exterminate a lot of people to achieve his economic ends.
Well,
Unless you're
I
Palestinian.
don't know about Trump. I mean, Biden is not exactly anyway. But yes, I mean, the points you raise are always going to be there, Judy. You know, yeah, we just have to judge, and people will debate, is this important enough that we forget about, we let bygones be bygones and do this, or is it, do we have to take a stand here? And people will have different lines where they go on that. And that's how social struggles work. At a certain point, at some points, people will do stuff even if they're practically sure to die, because they're just so pissed off or so desperate. And at other times, they're not going to do very much, even though they would stand to gain. But looking from a broader view, if you're, which Debord is, if you're saying what's going to happen with humanity here, and it may be that humanity is going to go down the drain if we just sit around and accept another $200 happily, because it's not getting to the, you know, the heart of things. Let's move on here. And again, we can always be coming back to these. So number 57, the society that bears the spectacle does not dominate underdeveloped reasons solely by its economic hegemony. It also dominates them as the society of the spectacle. Even where the material base is still absent, modern society has already used the spectacle to invade the social surface of every continent. It sets the stage for the formation of indigenous ruling classes and frames their agendas. Just as it presents pseudo goods to be coveted, it offers false models of revolution to local revolutionaries. The bureaucratic regimes in power in certain, remember when he says bureaucratic regimes, he's talking about Stalinism or similar kind of things. Regimes in power in certain industrialized countries, that would be like Russia, Czechoslovakia, a few others at that time, have their own particular type of spectacle, but it is an integral part of the total spectacle, serving as its pseudo-opposition and actual support. Even if local manifestations of the spectacle include certain totalitarian specializations of social communication and control, like Stalinism, Maoism, so on, from the standpoint of the overall functioning of the system, those specializations are simply playing their allotted role within a global division of spectacular tasks. Next thesis, although this division of spectacular tasks preserves the existing order as a whole, it is primarily oriented toward protecting its dominant pole of development, namely like the US. The spectacle is rooted in the economy of abundance, and the products of that economy ultimately tend to dominate the spectacular market and override the ideological or police state protectionist barriers set up by local spectacles with pretensions of independence. 59. Behind the glitter of spectacular distractions, a tendency toward banalization dominates modern society the world over, even where the more advanced forms of commodity consumption have seemingly multiplied the variety of roles and objects to choose from. So the implication is you would think that if there's a wide variety of things to choose from, that it's not going to be banal. It's going to be exciting and fulfilling or something. But he's saying, then he goes on, the vestiges of religion and of the family, parenthesis, the latter is still the primary mechanism for transferring class power from one generation to the next, in parenthesis. Those vestiges, along with the vestiges of moral repression, imposed by those two institutions, namely the family and the religion, can be blended with ostentatious pretensions of worldly gratification, precisely because life in this particular world remains repressive and offers nothing but pseudo gratifications. Complacent acceptance of the status quo may also coexist with purely spectacular rebelliousness. Dissatisfaction itself becomes a commodity as soon as the economy of abundance develops the capacity to process that particular raw material. So I'm going to read one more thing here. Stars, spectacular representations of living human beings, project this general banality into images of permitted roles. As specialists of apparent life, stars serve as superficial objects that people can identify with in order to compensate for the fragmented productive specializations that they actually live. The function of these celebrities is to act out various lifestyles or socio-political viewpoints in a full, totally free manner. They embody the inaccessible results of social labor by dramatizing the byproducts of that labor, which are magically projected above it as its ultimate goals, namely power and vacations. The decision-making and consumption that are at the beginning and the end of a process that is never questioned. On one hand, a governmental power may personalize itself as a pseudo-star. On the other, a star of consumption may campaign for recognition as a pseudo-power over life. But the activities of these stars are not really free, and they offer no real choices. So, actually, I'm going to read one more, and then we can stop. So in this thesis, we're also talking about, like the previous one, these stars. And note that he's already noted two types of stars. There's the star of consumption. That could be a star like the Beatles or Marilyn Monroe or some, it's like happy vacations. And the stars of power, which would be normally politicians, or maybe labor union bureaucrats would be another more minor one of that. So he's talking about these two types. So the agent of the spectacle, who is put on stage as a star, is the opposite of an individual. He is as clearly the enemy of his own individuality as of the individuality of others. Entering the spectacle as a model to be identified with, he renounces all autonomous qualities in order to identify himself with the general law of obedience to the flow of things. The stars of consumption, though outwardly representing different personality types, show each of these types enjoying equal access to and deriving equal happiness from the entire realm of consumption. The stars of decision-making must possess the full range of admired human qualities. Official differences between them are thus canceled out by the official similarity implied by their supposed excellence in every field of endeavor. As head of state, Khrushchev retrospectively became a general, so as to take credit for the victory of the Battle of Kursk in World War II, 20 years after it happened. And Kennedy, JFK, survived as an orator to the point of delivering his own funeral oration, since Theodore Sorensen continued to write speeches for his successor, LBJ, in the same style that had contributed so much to the dead man's public persona. The admirable people who personify the system are well known for not being what they seem. They attain greatness by stooping below the reality of the most insignificant individual life, and everyone knows it. End. So just to sum up here, we have those three theses about how the society, the spectacle, dominates the third world, for example, even though the third world is not developed enough to really have a multiple spectacle. The society of the spectacle will still come in there, and it's got something to give them. Like it may have ideas for as he says, false models of revolution to local revolutionaries. And in the bureaucratic ones like Stalinism or like Saddam or something like that, even though they seem to be very different and are in many ways, they too are serving just as a sort of they're sort of like a poor relative of the advanced capitalist spectacle. They don't have as many goods to divide, so they have to, in their case, they just have to sell the image of the leader, Stalin or Mao or somebody like that. And so then you've got that dissatisfaction, which will come up a little bit later. And then we've got those two theses on stars. The one kind of about stars as such, and then the agent of the spectacle. So questions and comments? Mike.
Hi. My comment is that the spectacle essentially, what I see here is a critique of the abstractions that we create. Like we create religions, that's an abstraction. We create exchange value, that's an abstraction. And we create stars, that's an abstraction. It's a pseudo, to devolve your life, to reify these abstractions and make them living is what is absent from our actual living as human beings. So we give power to those abstractions, including political leaders, including stars, but those people are they're actually created by us, but we don't. But the thing of it is that when he says at the last, he says, and the thing that from Pascal, we know it. We actually, I don't think we do know it. They're just garbage. They aren't real people and all this. I don't think we do know it. I think I see it all the time. But anyway, I'll shut up now.
Well, I would say to that I think in most of these cases, it's not quite that simple. One of the reasons that the system continues to work is that there is some quality in those things. I mean, if you have Marilyn Monroe, she is beautiful, and she was a real person. She wasn't just invented, and she was a real enough person to apparently have committed suicide, when she got, kind of freaked out by her weird position. And other stars, I mean, there are some stars that aren't very talented, but others are. I mean, there are just like there are some books that are highly loved, because there really is something there. If they were complete nonsense, they wouldn't last very long. So
I'm not intimating that it's complete nonsense. What I think is being critiqued is the giving away of our lives to the things that
yes,
we create,
absolutely,
and
yeah.
making those abstractions into living things. That's the reified notions, right?
Yeah.
I agree. Marilyn Monroe was beautiful, And there's nothing wrong with beauty, but to make beauty into an abstraction that dominates your life that's not living yourself.
Right.
That's giving up your autonomy.
Yeah.
And
in fact, it can be even more devastating if the star is more credible.
yeah.
You may recall that thing that I posted to you a few meetings ago, where when I was back in 1970, where I was first exploring the Situationists, and then Gary Snyder was coming to town to give a poetry reading. And I thought, now this could be an interesting challenge here, because I really admire him, and I still do. So I mean, it's easy to attack something that's completely idiotic, but can I confront this person who is very admirable and, superior to me in many regards and all that kind of thing? So, but in a way that can be even more addicting, you might say, because it's more credible. Just like if you are into religions, some religions are more appealing than others because the leader is actually a good guy, with some depth compared with some phony, televangelist or something. Peter.
Yeah, to look at, I guess 60 and to a certain extent 61, when he's talking about stars, he says they're spectacular representations of living human beings, and then they embody the inaccessible results of social labor. It just reminds me of Marx talking about alienation, and how in Marx's day, what made people feel human was just going out and purchasing anything that made them feel good, like liquor or food, or I think Marx says at some point just basically like all the animal functions. And then but the stars are the spectacular version of that, when we have all these commodities, right? I mean, now we're just kind of looking, we're not even doing it ourselves. We're watching these people do these things, right? And what are they doing? The stuff that we could be doing, right? We could be having a good life where we have power over the kind of things that we do, like work, social work, making stuff. But instead, we're looking at like politician celebrities that are making all the decisions instead of us. Or vacations, right? We don't want to be working anymore at these crappy capitalist jobs. So we watch like TV shows now that show us people on vacation. And I was just thinking, like, that's all like terrible reality television is just these beautiful people on vacation. Why? Because I don't get to take a vacation. I want to watch other people do it.
Yeah. Benjamin?
And I think that, I mean, Tom Frank had his thesis a few years ago, but I find on page 24, I mean, dissatisfaction itself becomes a commodity as soon as the economy of abundance develops the capacity to process that particular raw material. I love that. It's something in New York where we're based. We saw it. David Graeber became sort of a star, and I'm not knocking David Graeber. I mean, but during Occupy, it was fascinating to watch, and the same thing happened in ACT UP. There became media stars. There's social movement media stars. And Stanley Aronowitz once said, this is how the system absorbs us, right? Like, I mean, Lisa Fithian, there's an article about Lisa Fithian, who I think is a wonderful activist, who was filmed at Columbia last week, basically saying, everybody chill out, like you've got really important work to do. And so it becomes an article about the social movement star. And it does have a way of dividing people. And I think limiting our capacity, it's not about, I'm not knocking any of the individuals that I just mentioned, but it is odd to watch dissent becomes commodified.
Yeah.
And it becomes part of something to write about. And then there's some people that I found it very uncomfortable during Occupy to become media celebrities. They weren't ready for that. They were activists. They weren't ready to have the New York Times follow them around all the time. So I do think he's getting at a point about celebrity, and I think he became a celebrity too. And a lot of what you read about him is he drank a lot, and I'm not knocking that. I mean, it just sounds like he had a hard time with the view of himself as a celebrity.
Well, that is a whole other issue. Adam.
Hi, thanks. I'm basically interested in the idea of separate classes and having separate class interests. So the idea of Debord writing that the agent of the spectacle who's put on stage, and then continuing, is as clearly the enemy of his own individuality as the individuality of others. So I think this could be reading to me like this agent of the spectacle has some interest in changing this position if he's put into the position of being the enemy of his own individuality. But then maybe this is only true of the agent of the spectacle who's put on stage. So maybe the ones who are not put on stage do not become the enemy of their own individuality. I was curious if you had any reflections on that as it relates to the idea of agents of spectacle being, members of the class of the bourgeoisie, and then what their interests are in terms of maintaining the spectacle or perhaps abolishing it if it makes them into the enemies of their own individuality, basically.
Well, I mean, we're going here into one of the, remember I said we're taking the overview. In this one, we are looking to some extent at an individual. What is it like to be a politician, who's successful at the top of thing? What is it like to be one of the Beatles or, whatever there? And he is looking at that as to say that even rather than just saying these are bad guys or these people are selling out or something like that, he's actually pointing out that even on their own terms, they end up compelled to also be exploited in their way. I mean, when you're talking about are they dissatisfied, I mean, bear in mind a lot of them are getting paid a lot. So if you if the price of being a billionaire or the various perks that you get is that, oh, you don't have much privacy because people are always wanting to interview you or photograph you or something like that. Uh, uh, some people would make that trade-off very willingly, and others not so much. But he's pointing out that, again, remember when he talked about there's a banalization tendency in modern society. And part of this banalization is that these people who end up being stars for good or bad reasons end up sort of turned into just something that's lifeless. Even though you would think, man, if you were Paul McCartney or, the Rolling Stones or, some famous film actor or something like that, man, you can do it. Yeah, you can go to an expensive restaurant. You can have your private jet or, travel anywhere you want. But the world is still fucked up. you know, I mean, you're getting a much better deal than the person who's just homeless in the street, because you do have these choices. But if you look at a certain point and you're the Marilyn Monroe and she kills herself, I mean, and she's like at the peak, of her particular sector, you might say, when that happened, I mean, to the point that 50 years later, we still, a Marilyn Monroe almost means a gorgeously beautiful woman, something like that. And she no doubt had her fun, while she was in playing around in these things. But ultimately, apparently, she looked around and said, I can't stand this, for what whatever the particulars were. And we're looking at that same thing like with a politician where you think, man, yeah, this person, gets to boss everybody around or gets to, like if you're Trump, you have these vast crowds that think you're the greatest thing that ever hit the earth and all this. But really, in order to get there, what, it's not very appealing. And Debord isn't just saying that all this stuff is bad. he's pointing out that even at the other end of it, it's not that great. You know, it's got its own contradictions. It's got its own absurdities. So, Ed Matthews, you're muted.
There we go. You can
Yeah.
hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Just a quick point I wanted to add to what Peter had said earlier about reality TV shows. And 59, 16, 61, to me, really sort of talk about this idea that I'm sure at the time Debord was writing, he may have been thinking of Paris Match magazine, which is full of celebrities doing wonderful celebrity type things. And these days we've got Us Weekly and People and so on. But this idea of an apparent life, what is really pernicious about reality TV is how carefully constructed and edited this life, so-called lifestyle is, that it is as far removed from reality TV as a completely fictionalized film, but presented as if it were reality, which again doubles up this notion of a spectacle, that not only are these people incredibly wealthy, they don't have to work, they're constantly on vacation, they have time to do the things they love to do, and of course we watch them and hope we can be like them. And if we feel dissatisfied with our own lives, surprise, they're selling all kinds of products that are spun from the show. But the point I wanted to make was the way in which these reality television shows are so carefully crafted and constructed to present this alleged reality, which when I was reading this, the general banality, specialist of apparent life, that's the line that really struck me, the term that really underlines the, I don't want to call it evil, people still watch them, but the perniciousness of reality TV, the Kardashians and so on, is just that careful construction. And people think that this is life. Couldn't be further. I mean, how many times does somebody say yell at somebody else and, oh, take three? No, hang on, it's reality. So anyway, I just wanted to make that quick point because I know Debord there were no reality shows at the time, but it's remarkable how this passage is so relevant still today.
Yeah. Bruce.
Couple quick points. Quickly, you were referring to Marilyn Monroe as an example of how horrible things are once you realize that pinnacle of being fame and glory. I think an even better example would have been Robin Williams. But that said, the point I was wanting to make was this reference at the end of 59 about rebelliousness and dissatisfaction being turned into a commodity. I think I saw a perfect example of that a few years ago. I'm sure many of the people here remember 1969. At that time, Jefferson Airplane had a song called Volunteers, which was kind of an anthem of the youth rebellion, right? And yet, many years later, that very same song became the soundtrack to an ad for E-Trade to buy and sell stocks in the stock market. They held up E-Trade as kind of a revolution and played Volunteers as the background music to this revolution. The very song which had been such a quintessential example or expression of the youth rebellion of the late 1960s.
Yeah. Yeah. Judy.
Oh, yeah. Am I muted?
No, you're coming
Okay.
through.
I just wanted to say one thing about Marilyn Monroe. Well, two things, reality TV and Marilyn Monroe. I don't think Marilyn Monroe looked around at the world and was so disturbed she committed suicide. I think she had inner demons. And I think most people who commit suicide too, they have just so much turmoil from their past lives, whatever, that they don't want to go forward. I don't think it has anything to do that they think the world is screwed up or anything. I think it's kind of a
yeah,
personal
yeah.
personal thing. And also, I got to say about reality TV, of which I'm a kind of a fan of some of it. And years ago, the first reality TV I ever saw was some guy who was trying to get a band started, and he recruited these young guys who played instruments, and they had a band. And he was this big older guy, big fat guy, and they all lived in a house, and they had to kiss this guy's ass to stay in the band to, keep living free and blah blah blah. and it was the most fascinating show. I was just mesmerized by it because these poor young guys would do anything to keep this non-job they had. You know, it was just utterly fascinating how much they would give up to just live this life. And I gotta say, you know, most men, I don't know if the men in this group are like that, but a lot of men, they watch sports. And they're like always, oh, the Warriors, oh, the 49ers, blah, blah, blah. But if women watch reality TV, which is kind of like sports for women, it's just so degrading and so, oh, you can't even talk about it. It's so beyond the pale. But really, it's the same thing. It's like cartoons for adults. You know, like sometimes I watch these shows and it's sort of like nobody I know lives like this or has any kind of life like this. And so it's sort of fascinating in a way. I mean, this is sort of off the subject, but I mean, I really think that,
Well, Judy, nobody is saying these things aren't fascinating. That's why they work.
well, yeah, but I mean, I think they're fascinating for a reason too.
Well, of
And
course.
I don't
Of
think it's
course.
all, I don't think it's all
Of
bad.
course.
I
Of
don't think
course.
I don't think it's just degenerating. I mean, I think it teaches us something if you look at it like that. Like when I watched that first show, it taught me how far you'll degrade yourself to keep a easy job. You know?
I guess that's a good lesson to learn from reality TV. Dan,
Yeah, I'm just now thinking about this sort of dialectic between stardom and reality, and how some of these reality stars will actually become, you know, legitimate stars and act in fictional roles, and then vice versa. Some of these people become fascinated about the real lives of these people they know solely from fictional roles, right? So that's, I don't have any much further to say about that, but it seems like there might be something there to chew on. But what I've been chewing on for the last few minutes is actually number 58, which we haven't really touched on, which isn't about sort of the imbalance between different parts of the world, and I guess different countries is what we're meant to read here in part. If we think of the U.S. as a dominant pole of development, and thinking about, you know, living here in Mexico and trying to understand the relationship with the U.S. and its economy and its culture, and really the last line there really hits home about these ideological or police state protectionist barriers set up by local spectacles with pretensions of independence. And so this year in Mexico, just like in the US, it's a presidential election year, as well as the election for the mayor of Mexico City. And so it's sort of at least two political spectacles that I'm somewhat following. But this cultural domination of the US in a way, so people here, you know, like in most parts of the world, you know, love American culture, like they can't get enough of it. And yet politicians can always get votes and get elected in part by sort of putting on a show of resistance against that dominant culture. Also, of course, the dominant economy. But in Mexico, it's really interesting because they want to be friends with every country, both with the US and with Cuba and with Venezuela. And so economically, you know, they don't want to antagonize the US because they're so reliant on it. But yet, depending on who the campaign or the sub campaign is targeted to, you can get, again, a lot of votes by sort of demonizing the US, and yet you can't really criticize the culture because it's so popular. So again, I'm just sort of speculating on some of the stuff, but it's fascinating to look at it through Debord's theory.
Rudolf Hoffman.
Yes. My question is, what are the effects on the spectacle itself if an artist like Marilyn Monroe kills herself? And do you have any more interesting examples of artists who have a special, interesting relationship with the spectacle?
I'm not quite sure. You want other examples besides Marilyn Monroe?
Yeah, for you
Oh,
personally.
okay. Yeah, well, I'll at some point fairly soon, we'll be looking at Debord's film, The Society of the Spectacle. And in that film, the relation, he reads from the book, and the film does not exactly illustrate it, but there are some overlaps. And when he talks about the star, he does have a picture, a still of Marilyn Monroe, and he has some movies of the Beatles for about 30 seconds or something. It has them getting off a plane and John Lennon, looking at the cameras going, just sort of joking around, like, and then having them play music. And then in a related thing where they're talking about that, where dissatisfaction and rebelliousness themselves become a commodity, he has some French sort of junior Elvis people, rolling on the stage, in 1960 or something, exemplifying revolt, sort of juvenile revolt. So again, with some of those latter, I think you can say, well, he thinks this is just stupid. But I don't think he thinks the Beatles are just stupid. You think, I mean, there's a reason why they, you know, became so unusual. I mean, 60 years later, they're as popular as ever, really, in certain regards. And, I don't think the point is to say that these people are jerks or, bad people or stupid people or something like that. It's just that within this society, people try to make some kind of life that is interesting and fulfilling for themselves. And some of those people, it's a small minority, but some of them are musicians or writers or artists of different kinds, filmmakers and so on. And some of them do sort of serve that traditional role of art, which is to express freedom. I mean, it's an interesting idea, and it's one of the sources of the Situationist name. When they got our thing about creating situations, is that it's interesting that certain people, like a writer, a novelist or poet or somebody like that, or a songwriter, will embody in him or herself creativity. So there's some person who can kind of daydream and think, have different adventures and put it into words or into images, and he's very good at that. And when other people see that, they say, wow, that guy is great. It says something to me. What a beautiful poem, or like that movie. I can't get that tune out of my head. It's so exciting. And so that's not stupid. That's hitting actually pleasurable, fulfilling things in people, that make life seem beautiful for just a moment. And then maybe the next moment you say, oh, it's not really like that. But for a moment there, we were dancing together or we were doing this thing. And so that's exciting. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that life is not all like that, actually. That kind of thing is what we could be doing. I mean, to some extent, But most of the time we're doing stupid things like working in a factory that builds bombs to, or working in a building that sells insurance all these stupid things that this society decides are worth doing because somebody can make a profit on them. So these other things are hints of what life could be like. They're not, we don't want to say, let's look like reality TV and say, is that what life is like? Or do I want to, because that's not the case. But when you read an interesting novel or a nice song or something like this, you do get kind of a thrill that of the creativity, all that's going on there. So you may end up admiring the author or the actor or something like that. But the point is that it's communicated to you. And it's communicated to you, like you may go around 50 years later and you still hum that tune because somebody came up with that. How did they do it? Well, they just had a special talent or whatever. So that's great. But the problem is in our society, that's a very tiny exception. Like maybe 1 out of 1,000 people or 1 out of 1,000,000 people gets to do that and get paid for it and get praised for it and all that. And there are many other people who may, in some cases, be more skilled, more creative, and nobody ever hears about them because, the media people decide that they're not interested or whatever. There's a lot of different reasons. And so those people end up you never hear of them. The point is not to have more stars, but the fact that somebody is a star and everybody else is just looking, there's something wrong with that. Okay, temporarily, maybe. Okay, there's some
Temporarily, maybe.
great violinist and you listen to the a million people listen to the violinist. But there's the problem is that the kind of arts that we have in this society are so much that one way thing. And yeah, it's fine. I mean, I enjoy going to a concert, and hearing these things and reading a good book and all this kind of thing. But if
You,
that
you kind
becomes
of
the
you
dominant thing,
had to rethink concepts in a way. Like, do you think, would you say a great artist in his nature goes against the spectacle?
well, many modern artists have, in a way. And I mean, that was one of the Situationist theses, was that they looked back over the preceding 100 years or so, and they could see that the arts, poetry, various things like that, because they were creative and adventurous, they ended up expressing dissatisfaction with the existing society, so that you had whereas arts in previous centuries, a lot of times were just to praise the rulers or something like this, or assume that the society was the way it should be or the way it had to be. Whereas many modern artists were different, and extreme examples were like the Dadaists and Surrealists. And so those are the ancestors of the Situationists. Looking back, these are creative people who are expressing their creativity in antagonism to the system they're in one way or another. They can express that in different ways. Anyway, I think there's always this.
When I said what I meant by going against the spectacle, I think you covered it in the first video that's up on YouTube. It's not the most effective way to just call out the spectacle and express your dissatisfaction, but just by like you said before, like the Beatles just doing a great art, and like the Situationists taught just art bringing the people back to reality, back to the presence. Yes.
Yeah, this thing will come up later in the book also when we actually, there's a whole chapter about culture that has to do with arts and poetry and how these things intermingle. But yeah, as I say, the very origin of the Situationists is this contradiction with art. Like you have art has traditionally been the realm of creativity. If you were an artist, you had this very special and usually desirable career of just expressing your, making up stuff and, and creating it, whether, I mean, you're creating a beautiful building or a beautiful song or whatever. And that's what most people don't get. Most people are, doing some much more routine thing that they do not choose. Whereas a poet, is just whenever he feels like it, I mean, you can't just write a thing automatically, but he can just kind of drift around and, oh, that gives you an idea. And most of us don't live like that. We got to go to a job every day and, or school or various things like that. So, and in the past, maybe there was no alternative to that. There was less technological abundance and so on. So maybe back then people would say, well, we can't afford to have most people do that because we need people to raise the food. But nowadays, that's not much of an argument.
The spectacle dramatically changed how the life of artists. So it was in historic times. It was very different to.
Yeah, well, the life of the artist was never all that great because it's been very volatile all the time. In the old days, you had to kiss the king's ass, or the rich person's ass, or else you were rejected. As long as you did that, then yes, you get to eat dinner at the with the.
I think it's today. It's still pretty much like that.
Yeah,
but more abstracted.
Yeah. Sid, we haven't heard from you.
So regarding this question of artists and Hoffman, I was thinking about what Hoffman's one of his first questions was how does the spectacle deal with suicide, like the suicide of Marilyn Monroe, and then someone else mentioned Robin Williams, and I also. There's another person that came to mind in part of this discussion was that kind of was upsetting Anthony Bourdain, who I don't know if people know about him. He was like a guy who traveled around the world and checked out food in all different places around the world. And so to me, the fact that these people who've gone to the height of their professions as artists or something akin to artists commit suicide, which is very upsetting and, it's sort of disturbing, right? Like why and all that is the question that comes up. But to me, what comes to my mind is that it just isn't enough, that at some point, a person who's doing that just realizes it's not enough and decides, to kill themselves, right? I mean, I like and in terms of Hoffman's question, he says, well, how does the spectacle relate to the suicide? So in the case of all of these things, I think the spectacle or it makes a spectacle of grief. We sort of have this whole show of grief and all that. I one image that came up to me while we were talking is that, well, there's two things. One is there was a moment where I was playing at being an artist as a photographer, and that was, somehow I was going to change the world by being a photojournalist, or somehow exposing something. But but I was just thinking about it, talking about that to someone else recently. It's like right now, that wouldn't be enough for me. It's just not enough. It doesn't work anymore. Because it's so part of you've just become part of the existing thing, right? That we've been talking about. The last image to share is that perhaps people realize, for some reason, the image of cutouts, the cutouts come up to me. And if one was like someone like Marilyn Monroe or Robin Williams is like a really good example, because he at some level was a resistor. He was trying to, using his brilliance and wit and all of this, he was trying to expose, in the films and the movies he did and everything. He was like, I think there was an element of what he was doing that was anti-spectacular, right? But and he used drugs and all this, but he probably had various things with chemistry in his body and stuff like that. But at a certain point, if you've done all this stuff and all that comes out is you see yourself as a cutout, right? And it's like, oh fuck, like this is my whole life, and all I really am is a cutout. Which to me is, at some level, is the essence of, one part of the essence of the spectacle.
Thanks. Benjamin?
And I think it gets to this question about individual agency. And I think part of what's I've always been drawn to this framework is that it suggests that the city is a mutable object, and that we can, despite the idea we can be commodified within the descent, obviously within the panopticon, but we can also act as individuals. And I think that's at least what seems to me is striking. And his work, and thank you for reminding me, I did find the stuff on Lefebvre, which is great in here. But do you feel like he maintained that idea of individual agency? I know a lot of, after the 60s, some people didn't feel that, but I see it as a thread all the way through this material, is that individuals can still always
of course
disrupt the spectacle.
Yeah, this I hear this so much, and it always kind of puzzles me. I mean, what is Debord about? I mean, you have these phrases like individual agency. I mean, this is making it too complicated. It just means, can somebody do something? Well, of course they can. You'd have to be a postmodernist idiot to not know that. I mean, and yet people will say the postmodernists are like the Situationists. They have nothing to do with that. And yet, for some reason, just because there's talk about the spectacle or something, people conclude without even looking at it. They say, oh, he thinks everything's a spectacle. Nothing matters. It's all nihilism. This is not, I mean, this whole book is written 100% in order to overthrow this society personally by people doing it. That's all it's about. Many of the things we're talking about are just sort of tangential little aspects, but that's the reason that he did it. And that's the reason that he formed that little group back in the 50s. And and all these various things. Now, he could have made mistakes or made misjudgments of who he's working with or various things like that. But all of this is extremely practical. You know, it's based on life. And the things that sometimes seem rather dramatic and exotic about the Situationists, like when you go back, you know, it's kind of romantic, like it's sort of like the Surrealists and the Dadaists, and you know, or even going back to Rimbaud or somebody like that. You know, these are sort of dramatic things that you say, oh, that's wow, those people are really far out, you know, imaginative or something. But where that comes from, in Debord's case, and in the case of many of his comrades, friends, is it comes from things that they did in order to make life not just, as the phrase goes, not just another 24 hours going by, to make it something exciting. And in one of Debord's films, early films, he says, as a narrator, he says something like, we want, here, let me get the exact quote. Well, I'm not going to, it's something like, what we want is the most radical change in the direction of liberation possible, not just in historical context, but right here and right now. So obviously, right now, you can't have, you know, a revolution that's going to happen tonight or tomorrow or something, you know, just because that's what you want. But starting from that attitude, it's like, what am I going to do with my life?
Right.
I mean, that's pretty basic. And it's the question that everybody asks himself at some point, or at points, times they say, what am I going to do? And the reason they don't do something that may be more interesting or fruitful in a radical sense is that they're overwhelmed by habitual things, like things that they have to do, and it just looks like it's not possible to do very much else. And so it looks like the only thing that you have is that after you've worked and commuted and, you know, done the laundry and other things, and you've got an hour or two to spare, then you turn on the TV or something in order to get some vicarious excitement.
Right.
You know, and so through experience, you learn, oh, I get a lot of relatively satisfying excitements by this actor or this author or this filmmaker, or this song rock group, or this classical composer, or whatever, you know, whatever it may be. And then you can say, oh, boy, finally, I've got an hour or two to settle back, you know, oh, that's beautiful. You know, and you can sort of live an imaginary life, either identifying with the characters, or if you get a little more specific, sophisticated, you even not necessarily identify with the characters. You can kind of laugh at the characters and appreciate the ironies, and that this is an anti-hero and not somebody you would identify with, but you can appreciate that this is an interesting creation that somebody presented you. And so, oh, I'm going to read another book by that guy, you know, or I'm going to buy another album by that group, or whatever. That's completely understandable, you know, because that's pretty much, that's all we can do. And then if occasionally something will go wrong with the system, you know, like there's a war or there's a disaster, or there's some unforeseen thing, like where people are expressing dissatisfaction, like Occupy Wall Street or something like that. And then suddenly there's an opening. And then people, it's amazing how fast they do wake up. You know, instead, whereas they're normally just, hey, don't bother me about all this fancy abstract jargon here. You know, I just want to go see this movie. I want to listen to this and or take a drug or get drunk or something. But suddenly, if they suddenly see, wow, there's all these people and ideas are floating around and people are calling things into question. What? How can they question that? Well, why not? Well, you know, and in just a few days, suddenly they're questioning things. People that have never had an intelligent thought in their life or something will come up, you know, and say, well, why don't we do that? Or how come we can't do that? Or, or something. And so Debord is also aware of that possibility because it has happened. You know, I mean, if those things hadn't happened, we would still be slaves.
And the spectacle can become a source of dissent. I mean, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, Pete Seeger, you know, getting people to participate in his shows. Pete Seeger didn't sit by himself and say it's me. He got everybody to participate. So I do think we can take this being a spectator and turn it into we're all participants. And I think that's what this sort of invites. Anyway, thank you. I agree. I appreciate the thread. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've got a little bit more time. Let's go a little further here. Number 62. The false choices offered by spectacular abundance, choices based on the juxtaposition of competing yet mutually reinforcing spectacles and of distinct yet interconnecting roles, signified and embodied primarily by objects. All these things develop into struggles between illusory qualities designed to generate fervent allegiance to quantitative trivialities. Fallacious, archaic oppositions are revived. Regionalisms and racisms, which serve to endow mundane rankings in the hierarchies of consumption with a magical ontological superiority. Ontological, it means that they're inherently superior. You know, they're just magically. And sub-playful enthusiasms are aroused by an endless succession of farcical competitions, from sports to elections. Wherever abundant consumption is established, one particular spectacular opposition is always in the forefront of illusory roles, the antagonism between youth and adults. But look, this is really neat. Look how he takes apart those two things here. But real adults, i.e., people who are masters of their own lives, are in fact nowhere to be found. And a youthful transformation of what exists is in no way characteristic of those who are now young. It is present solely in the economic system, in the dynamism of capitalism. It is things that rule and that are young, vying with each other and constantly replacing each other. What a beautiful way of flipping the whole generation gap. Next one, spectacular oppositions conceal the unity of poverty. If different forms of the same alienation struggle against each other in the guise of irreconcilable antagonisms, this is because they are all based on real contradictions that are repressed. The spectacle exists in a concentrated form or a diffuse form, depending on the requirements of the particular stage of poverty it denies and supports. In both cases, it is nothing more than an image of happy harmony, surrounded by desolation and horror, at the calm center of misery. I'm going to go on here. Let's see. Yeah. So he's mentioned the concentrated and diffuse forms of the spectacle. So here's the concentrated form, and then the next thesis is the confused. But the concentrated form obviously is things like Stalinism, Maoism, the Nazis. The concentrated spectacle is primarily associated with bureaucratic capitalism, That means state capitalism like Russia. So, though it may also be imported as a technique for reinforcing state power in more backward mixed economies, that would be like Saddam's Iraq, for example, or even adopted by advanced capitalism during certain moments of crisis, like Nazi Germany. Bureaucratic property is itself concentrated in that the individual bureaucrat takes part in the ownership of the entire economy only through his membership in the community of bureaucrats. And since commodity production is less developed under bureaucratic capitalism, it too takes on a concentrated form. The commodity the bureaucracy appropriates is the total social labor, and what it sells back to the society is that society's wholesale survival. The dictatorship of the bureaucratic economy cannot leave the exploited masses any significant margin of choice because it has had to make all the choices itself, and any choice made independently of it, whether regarding food or music or anything else, thus amounts to a declaration of war against it. This dictatorship must be enforced by permanent violence. That could also be like unceasing violence. It doesn't mean it's going to last forever. It means it's constant. Its spectacle imposes an image of the good which subsumes everything that officially exists. An image which is usually concentrated in a single individual, the guarantor of the system's totalitarian cohesion. Everyone must magically identify with this absolute star or disappear. This master of everyone else's non-consumption is the heroic image that disguises the absolute exploitation entailed by the system of primitive accumulation accelerated by terror. If the entire Chinese population has to study Mao to the point of identifying with Mao, this is because there is nothing else they can be. The concentrated spectacle implies a police state. 65. The diffuse spectacle is associated with commodity abundance, with the undisturbed development of modern capitalism. That's us, more or less. Here, each individual commodity is justified in the name of the grandeur of the total commodity production, of which the spectacle is a laudatory catalog. Irreconcilable claims jockey for position on the stage of the affluent economy's unified spectacle, and different star commodities simultaneously promote conflicting social policies. The automobile spectacle, for example, strives for a perfect traffic flow, entailing the destruction of old urban districts, while the city spectacle needs to preserve those districts as tourist attractions. The already dubious satisfaction alleged to be obtained from the consumption of the whole is thus constantly being disappointed because the actual customer can directly access only a succession of fragments of this commodity heaven, fragments which invariably lack the quality attributed to the whole. Let's stop there. So basically, we've got those false choices, including the youth, old age choice, and so on. And then we've got those two different types of spectacle. Bruce.
Yeah, as I think I said in previous meetings, when I was in university, I focused on Soviet studies, so I had a pretty good understanding of that system. And I really identified with this one section of number 64, which is about how they have to make all the choices for everybody all the time and become basically complete exercise complete domination over every aspect of life. But the really, really brilliantly insightful point was that the choice that any choice that made independently intrinsically threatens the entire edifice. And that really is absolutely true, because that system was very, very frail and very, very brittle and unable to cope with change. And you would see it repeatedly in Eastern Europe during the period where the Soviets controlled it, that the slightest opening of society would lead to an absolute complete rebellion that had to be somehow authority somehow had to be restored, usually by force, sometimes by tanks. And you can even see it, even though they got a mixed economy now, you can even see it in China today, because any manifestation of dissent in China has the immediate capability to proliferate and spread like wildfire. What happened in 1989 around Tiananmen Square epitomized that. And it was also true about a year or so ago during the COVID crisis, that there was an outbreak of protests over COVID restrictions in China, and it immediately spread like wildfire and would threaten to get out of control and posed a really profound challenge to the authority of the Chinese Communist Party. That system is very, very incapable of tolerating any kind of independent activity whatsoever, for the very reasons that Debord spells out here, is that it has to absolutely control everything, and if it doesn't, it's immediately put at risk in terms of being continued existence.
Yeah.
It was a really, really, I mean, I've come to that conclusion for years now about that system, but Debord is the first person who I've read who really spelled out in no uncertain terms that fact and showed that he thoroughly grasped it.
Yeah. Sid? You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great point there, Bruce. But when you made me think, it's China, but it's not only China, the COVID-19 thing, like it happens here. That was one of the most extreme difficulties that I had during the COVID, the extreme and quick repression of any kind of dissent or thoughts about, or questions even about what was going on. It's like US, it was basically the same as China. Here there was no room for dissent. There's still no room for dissent, pretty much. There's huge amount, what do they call it? The censorship industrial complex. And curiously, this is a struggle for me right now. Curiously, one of my temporary heroes was Robert Kennedy Jr. with his Children's Health Defense website, where I learned all kind of interesting things about, viruses and so-called vaccines and all this other stuff, which sort of made a huge amount of sense to me. And now, and he's like, he became the face of, for a moment in my thinking, he became the face of rebellion, or what do you call it? Disagreement or
Dissatisfaction.
satisfaction, dissent, right? But now at the same time, the really kind of weird thing is that it seems like he's he's so totally become part of the whole thing that he supposedly is against, and like the contradictions that I'm hearing are expressed, like the unadulterated support for Israel, and support by like the MAGA crowd and all the rest of that stuff. It's kind of like, he was like a hero for a second, and I wouldn't say revolutionary, but some sort of a dissenter against the predominant paradigm of, get the jab and, lock down and wear masks and all this other shit. And which I still sort of have sympathy for. At the same time, he becomes, in a way, he became like a star in my mind of that. But then there's this other stuff that comes up that just makes him part of the whole thing. It's kind of about enough for me, I guess.
Yeah, you raised a number of interesting issues there, but I think just one or two things I want to mention is that part of the power of the spectacle is confusion. We think of this side against this side or something like this, but actually, one of the ways that the spectacle or the system, you might say, is so strong is that whenever there's any challenge to it, it just muddles things. So that it doesn't have to be anybody planning it. Basically, you've got millions of people out there that are doing various things, and all you need to do is let the occasional voice like that get on the mainstream thing, and then it'll say, oh, well, that sounds interesting, and then this person is thinking, oh, that sounds pretty radical, and oh, how can we do that? But wait a minute, he's supported by Trump, and blah, blah, blah. And so anything or anybody that seems to represent some challenge, they want to bring it into that whirlpool so that people are going to sit around for hours and days and weeks debating, well, is he really sincere when he says this? Or is it true that the vaccines are doing blah, blah, blah? Or is that, and there are some things on both sides. There's no solid thing that the vaccines are right, guess who's making them? But there's enough of kernels of truth there, that somebody's doing something because they bribed the government, or somebody else is doing this because they're friends of this, or enough muddle that you just get all the, and then finally you get discouraged because, well, I don't know, who am I going to vote for? This guy said this, but this, and you forget sort of basic things because you're caught up in these. The big deal about conspiracy theories is not whether they're true or not, but that they're there and they muddle everything. So we can come back to some of those things that
takes away your energy, and it kind of makes you lose sight of the kind of thing that Debord is like, kind of like.
Yeah. Peter.
Yeah, the two theses that I thought were really fascinating. I mean, you brought it up, but 62, where he talks about real adults are nowhere to be found. And I think this is such a perfect way of putting it. Like, real adults would be producers in control of the means of production, and it would be a communist society. Instead, what we get is this like spectacular representation of the adult. Like when I was a kid, you'd look up to adults and you're just like, oh, they know everything. Like they run things, and what do I know as a kid, right? And then you realize it's bunk, but they still act like it to lord it over kids. And then kids are supposed to be the ones that are bringing change, but it's really just companies selling bullshit products to us, and the kids are just consuming them. I mean, that's really what it is, that they're a new market for these goods. So they have all, and then adults are like, oh, things are changing. The kids are changing things. And it's just companies introducing new products. The kids don't have any power to change anything. And they just fight with each other.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I thought 665, when he's talking about the diffuse spectral, is really, really interesting when he says that the star commodities simultaneously promote conflicting social policies. So it's like you've got the food companies are selling us eat all this stuff, it's great, it's gonna taste great, but then there's other companies that are like, here's a weight loss drug. You know, and so it's like, you know, what are you doing? Or, you know, the other products that that compete for your attention. There's no way that we're ever going to get to consume all of them and be happy, because
Yeah.
they're asking so many different things of us, you know.
Well, you can think of public utility companies, not public, actually. I mean, they're actually private in most cases, where they say, okay, we're giving you energy, you know, you've got to pay us, da, da, da. And then solar energy comes in. And then they appeal to the government. They say, well, we're losing some of our customers here, so maybe you can tax the solar to discourage it a little, you know,
Yeah.
or something. Or if there's a drought, you know, they say, well, don't water your lawn, you know, go light on the water. And then the water company says, well, we need to charge more because we're not selling as much water.
Right. Right there.
Oh, okay, I think this will be a good way to wind down here. It's almost 7 my time. Rudolph, unmute yourself. You're muted.
Of course, of course. So one last thing that came to mind. Before, one last question I had is when you said the book itself, it was an attempt to bring down the system, right?
Right.
But it didn't yet.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
but okay. But if there was a kind of a messiah figure, someone who would eventually follow in Debord's footsteps and actually bring down the system, what kind of person would it take? Would it be more of a like politician or maybe even an artist?
well, I think it would have to be a whole lot of different people. I mean, this idea of one person doing this. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Debord and these things, but look, he's just one person who came up with some ideas, just like Marx did a century earlier and stuff like that. So we can use some things like that. But Debord's whole lesson is that you cannot rely on a star like that on an individual. It's unhealthy. And Debord himself, at certain points in the thing, is saying, what is being advocated here is for the general population to do stuff. And that's harder to do. I mean, it would be easier if you could say, well, can he teach one other person to be another genius or something and do this? But it has to be the people doing this. It doesn't have to be millions of people at once.
And the artist is in the role who has the power to inspire the people too through their creativity.
I mean, Debord's contention is that kind of artist is kind of obsolete now. I mean, that there were times in the past where an artist, you might say, did sort of was in the forefront. And now he's saying that that's not so much the case, so that it's not a matter of creating art. It's like bringing the art creativity that has previously been manifested in art into everybody's lives. So it's much more interesting if, say, 100 people get together, discuss, try out, different things, and do something, than for one person to have a great idea and this, because these people are already starting to implement what would need to happen. Like in something like May 68 in France, you really did not have leaders. I mean, the people who were the supposed leaders were the problem. And certainly you did not have artists and song makers doing much of anything. I mean,
Yeah.
and there were people who thought, oh yeah, let's write songs for this or something, but that really had not very much to do with it. Like most of the whole thing was not in words to music or in creative things like that. It was in efforts to communicate subversively. And to do that, you had to use some creativity and imagination to figure out how can we communicate with this type of person, how when the factory gates are locked, for example, and we're trying to talk with the workers who are occupying the factories, or how do we, when they were fighting police in the streets, that requires a different kind of communication. So
we talked about the superstars like the Beatles and Marilyn Monroe. Kim said in chat something interesting about Mozart. Maybe we can talk about it after the session.
Yeah.
But on the more contemporary art side, from new music, Kanye West, or Ye, formerly known as, or you might know as Kanye West. He's he now goes by the name of Ye, and he in a way he killed this old superstar persona of his, Kanye West. He killed the persona, but now he still has the attention of the people. And to me, it's very interesting what he's doing right now. He's so anti-system and so releasing his music without record labels, and
I would question whether what he's doing is that interesting, but I mean, personally, I don't know.
For me, it got me thinking about. It brought me to the Society of the Spectacle and made me aware.
I mean, okay. As Bonagem wrote in about 60 years ago in one of the things in the Situationist Anthology, he says already, he's writing in the early 60s, there are dissatisfactions among the leading stars.
Yes.
And he gave an example of Brigitte Bardot having an interview, and she said, it's really crazy that, I'm at the focus of attention here with this. I mean, think of the Beatles, some of them are various of the earlier rock stars also did things like at a certain point, they just said, fuck it, I'm not making any more music, or I'm just going on, doing something completely different.
They all went out of the picture in a way. But now with the internet, what's so interesting to me about Ye now is that he still manages to somehow keep the attention of the people.
Well, I would just
even without the media machine.
Yeah, when I hear about things like that, I always question, like they say, oh, well, he's got the attention. Yeah, but to say what? I mean, whenever I hear of them, they're usually saying something completely idiotic, so what if they have the attention? But I can assume, okay, he's, there's this process that goes on. If you are up there and you're a millionaire, you can do whatever you want, and you're not going to starve, And in fact, it may be more famous to say, oh, he's he's saying, don't listen to me. Isn't that cool? So some people can do that, but I'm not counting on those people to come over. I mean, maybe some of them do, but more of them will do that if there are other people happen. If there's something like May 68, you'll see a lot of people doing stuff like that. Because that's what happens when there's a mass movement. You know, the people at the top adjust.
So
And they
what
may be
actually brought me to
inspired by
the
it, or they
society of the
may be afraid of it and say, I better start saying some radical stuff here so that people think I'm still cool or something, you know, that they wouldn't say under normal conditions.
Mhm. To quote some of his lyrics, what brought me to the society of the spectacle, it lines up with what Debord is saying in thesis 60 when he's saying the ultimate goal, power and vacations. In the song is actually sampling a song from the 1975 from the 20th century steel band, Heaven and Hell, and I'll just play you a 10 second clip of it.
Okay.
No more promos, no more photos, no more logos, no more chocos. We on Bezos, we get payrolls, trips to Legos, connect like Legos, make this.
Yeah. So when he says no more photos, no more logos, and the Society of the Spectacle is working with the collection of images.
Yeah, but it's the Society of the Spectacle is, as Debord points out, it's not just images, and it's not specific things like logos or ads or
yes,
whatever. I mean, you can get, like, anybody can say, I'm pissed off, enough of this, and you know, there's nothing very original in that, and it also doesn't do very much good because people say, yeah, so what? What are you going to do about it? And the answer is nothing, because what he's saying is not saying anything at all except saying that he doesn't like a lot of stuff. And you can talk to anybody, even a conservative person, and there's a lot of stuff they don't like about how the world is. Just go into any bar and they spend their time moping around and saying how crooked the politicians are, or how high the prices are, or how stupid some other people is, you know, or some other race is or something. I mean, it's just a complaint. And in certain times that may, okay, he's saying he's dissatisfied, or at least he's pretending to be dissatisfied because it sounds good. But so, to me, so what? This is Debord, this book is not Debord's way of saying he's dissatisfied.
it's
He
like
doesn't
what you
give a
said
shit.
on in the
He is
last session,
he
and
is
then the
dissatisfied.
media presents it. The media presents it, and then just goes like, and here's the weather, and goes to the next and makes it a part of the spectacle. But I think it's interesting when he says we on Bezos, we get payrolls, trips to Lagos. It's exactly like the trips, the power and the vacation. So I think he's it just got me invested to read the work. And,
yeah, that's good. So that is an example of this guy having some good effect. But
yeah,
I'm
so
just
now
saying,
wrapping it up,
if
going
you're
back to my original question now, this is all happening right now, but what would be the do you have any idea of what an artist goes from just criticizing that to actually having an effect and
well, actually,
bringing down the spectacle?
the Situationists generally, there might be some exceptions, said that we don't think there's any role for that anymore. They did not imagine, you know, like, oh, if only some star would make a different song and sing it. That was not the point. Largely, they were saying all that is already co-opted. You know, like it's already neutralized, including these things like the thing that you just played that sounds like it's real angry and real extreme and fuck that and fuck this and I don't want any more of that. I mean, that's pure spectacle. It's just verbiage. I mean, anybody can, a 3-year-old can say that. I don't like that. I don't like
It's
that. I don't like that.
making a spectacle to attack the spectacle.
Well, it's just that person is thoroughly living in the spectacle. You might say Kanye, whatever his name is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
you know, like it's sort of like a millionaire telling homeless people what they should do. I mean, Kanye can do that because he probably makes a lot of money from that very thing that you played there. But most other people have to do shit jobs, bullshit, as David Graeber calls them, or, you know, all kinds of other things are going on. And this isn't having any effect whatsoever on that, except just as a sort of symptom. I mean, there is a symptom, just like in those people that committed suicide, the famous ones, or something like that. You have other famous people who are doing things like this. And what that means is that it just gives the millions of people who are listening some other thing to argue about, like, oh, what do you think about that new thing of Kanye? Do you think that's radical? Or, you know, they're talking about something that has nothing to do with them, really. And yet, and if somebody said, oh, those stars are spoiled, they're rich, they don't know what they're doing, then somebody said, oh, well, wait a minute, what about this guy? He's a real guy, you know? So you can see it becomes just like a politician saying that another politician is crooked.
Mm-hmm. And this is the song, especially with the sample, he sets the stage when the sample says, children growing, women producing, men go to work and some go stealing. Everyone's got to make a living. He kind of sets the stage what you just said. And I think it's just interesting how he's, for me, the first one here, when talks about Mozart and the Beatles and artists from past generations. And now he kind of killed his public persona, and it just felt different to me and made me investigate. So
well, no, it's an interesting process.
Yes,
but this is not the you know, Debord's idea is not that, oh, if we can only get some star to do this thing that will convert everybody. His notion is that in general, the relation of the population to people like Kanye is sick. You know,
come again? Can you
sick,
repeat that?
ill, like insane, unhealthy.
What is unhealthy?
The relation of having millions of people that are sitting to, you know, listening to some guy complain about something.
Oh, yes.
I mean,
for
they're
both
complaining
sides,
about something
for both
too,
sides unhealthy.
but instead they're identifying like, oh, he speaks for me. Maybe we should elect him president. You know, has nothing to do with anything. You know, this has very little. I mean, it's a gut reaction. Okay, you know, maybe the guy is sincere in doing that, but that's not saying very much. Bruce, did you have some comment on this issue?
Yeah, I think you really need to come back to something that came up during the discussion of the Situationist Anthology. And that is that the goal of the Situationists, as I understand it, is to realize all power to the workers' councils, with the workers' councils becoming the mechanism or the vehicle through which the proletariat takes complete control of society and becomes masters of their own destiny and determines their own determines the direction and control of society and effectively abolishes the spectacle.
So obviously to do that is a big.
But that's why there's no role for stars or particular artists or anything like that. That the real fundamental role, the real pivotal role has to be played by the proletariat collectively, taking control of society through the workers' councils, and the workers' councils becoming the vehicle for the transformation of society as desired by the proletariat.
Okay, but then would the role of the artist would then be to inspire them?
The role of the artist, in my view, would be you're right, inspire them, but it would also to articulate that vision and create art which would be conducive to achieving that objective.
Yeah. In the
And
situation,
I think the one person who had, and to some degree in the history of art and culture, the one person who to some degree expressed that, although in the end he didn't, was Bertolt Brecht.
Yeah.
Because if you look at his tributes to Rosa Luxemburg and Carl Liebknecht, and the music and the poetry he put together around that, it all flows out of the experience of the workers' councils in Germany after the First World War.
Okay, I will look into that. Thank you.
Yeah, anyway, this thing, we'll come back to the issue of art later in the book, but I think the main thing is that the Situationists felt that for the most part, art was part of the problem. That you could, it contained creative aspects, but in the present context, to just create another work of art, another song, another poem, or something like this, the world is full of that stuff, and most of it doesn't do anything. So maybe there's exceptions here or there, but they didn't think that, when the Surrealists started in the 20s, they thought that maybe their art would contribute toward changing the world. But when you look at it in retrospect, their art just ended up being in museums and in rich people's homes. And it might have changed some people's mindsets a little bit, but the change is rather vague. And a lot of it was not much of a change. It just, a few other artists became rich and other ones committed suicide, something, but it didn't accomplish the thing. So the Situationists thought, now we think the point is not to create works of art, but to create situations. That's where the name comes from. And creating situations is a much bigger task, operation, challenge. But they think that is where you're getting the artistic creativity, but you're expanding it into other terrains. So I think we've already run over a little bit ways, but thank you very much for interesting and provocative questions and comments here. And we'll see you in another 2 weeks. I'll be sending you an email tomorrow, but basically we'll finish this chapter and maybe get started in the next chapter. So thank you very much again, and see you in a couple weeks.
Ciao, Ken.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, before I've ended it, I will be saving the chat to my computer, but if there was anything in the chat you want to copy, go for it now. And meanwhile, I will stop our recording.
Thanks, Ken.